The following message is from Hillsdale Baptist Church in Advance, North Carolina. Learn more about Hillsdale by visiting their website, www.hillsdalebaptistchurch.org. Thanks for listening. Now here is the message.
All right, let's go ahead and get started so that we can get through the rest of our study. The copy that you got today, if you got one today, we started last week. So we'll do a quick review with that one and then move into it. So where we are right now in chapter 4 is we are in the spot to where we're describing what's around the throne of God. And so with that said, we see something around, and those are the what? The cherubim, or the four living creatures. And again, we mentioned just a quick review starting in verse 6. You have 4 living creatures covered with eyes in front and in back were around the throne on each side. So we have this vision of these creatures. Now, like I said last week, as we were studying biblical prophecy, or we're just studying Bible knowledge generally, always remember that the Bible is one complete book. The author is God. And so what that means is that sometimes if we need more clarification of a specific section, it's always best to contextualize it within the whole Bible. So last week, what we started off with is are there any other examples of these 4 living creatures in the Bible before? Because otherwise, this is all we can see it as. But last week, what we did is we took some time to look at Ezekiel, and we also looked at Isaiah. So if you want to know the best examples of those, again, Ezekiel chapter 1 and Isaiah chapter 6 are where we get another example of these cherubims. Sometimes we can also call them seraphims also, because that's what Isaiah is going to call them. And when we read the Isaiah text, it was extremely hard to interpret all of it, because all of a sudden it's talking about these creatures that have wheels, that move around, but they don't turn. They just go wherever the Spirit leads. And so it gets even more complicated to try to visualize that. But as we move forward, I started off by simply saying, like question or statement 1 is that these are not beasts. Whenever some Bible translations, it might even be the King James and earlier editions, would try to categorize these creatures as beast. They're not. That's a completely different word in the Greek. In the Greek, we have this word is going to be zao, Z-A-O, in the Greek original, which means living creature, whereas it's not theum, which is going to be beast. So it's a completely different word. So these are living beings, not beast. With that said, we also talked about a unique characteristic is we actually have reference in the Bible of one of these cherubims. And many didn't realize that this was one of the cherubims from last week. Who is an example of a cherubim in the Bible? Satan. Satan is a cherubim. So what we did last week, we took a brief moment just to compare that there are differences between the angels themselves. There's different hierarchies within the angels, but there's also different living creatures or different angels in themselves. And what we can assume from reading the text is we can assume that the cherubim are the highest form of angels. So the highest tier because of their proximity to God himself. And so Lorraine made the good combination comparing Michael the archangel to Lucifer. And I don't know biblically, but from the looks of it is that Lucifer would be a more powerful angel than Michael, because Michael is an archangel, which is different than the cherubim. So that was a new thought for us last week, and I wanted to say that because I wanted you to have in your mind of who our enemy is and how powerful our enemy is. And so did anybody have any thoughts from that last week? Any epiphanies, any new questions that came from last week, since you had time to think about it? I guess not. So let's pick it up. Again, if you missed last week, in the handout that I gave you on the third page, which is the second piece of paper, is all the answers to the fill in the blanks. So if you missed any last week, you can look at those fill in the blanks. But we're going to pick up today in verse 7. So verse 7 of chapter 4, it starts off by saying, the first living creature was like a lion, the second living creature was like an ox, the third living creature had a face like a man, and the fourth living creature was like a flying eagle. So the statement that I wrote, number 6 there, is the 4 living creatures had responsibility, which was symbolized in their faces. So when we're looking at Bible prophecy, we have to make some sort of connection between what John is seeing or what the prophet is seeing, because the prophet is going to try to relate what they know to the indescribable. And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to figure out what would John think these critters are, so that we can see what potentially their responsibility is. So the 4 faces, and that's similar to what we read in Ezekiel, we don't expect it to be exact. So there's a little bit of difference between how they describe them in Ezekiel and in John. We don't expect it to be exact because it's a vision. And it's an indescribable one at that. So it's hard to describe the indescribable. So with that said, Ezekiel cherubims resembled human beings, generally, and they had some kind of characteristics of a lion, the calf, the man, and the eagle. Now, Ezekiel tells us that all of them had all the faces. So when we look at Ezekiel, we see this, but when John doesn't say that. The way John describes it, as if each of the critters were looking at him, but they had a different face looking at him. So we take the 2 combinations of Ezekiel and we take John and we compare the 2 and try to put it in context. So what John is seeing is Ezekiel sees all 4 creatures with the 4 different faces, but what John sees are 4 creatures with a different face looking at them. Do you see the difference there? So Ezekiel could see all 4 faces, but John sees 4 creatures with 4 different faces. So taking the 2, we can realize that Ezekiel's is right, but John is seeing a limited view. He's not seeing all their 4 different faces. So now it comes down to, what do these faces mean? Do they have some sort of symbolic meaning behind it? And so what I want to do is I want to try to give you really basically 3 leading theories of what the faces are and what they might symbolize. Again, we can't be overly dogmatic about it because, again, the Bible is not extremely clear, but when we look at it through the lens of these creatures have some sort of responsibility, then the faces of the creatures must represent some level of responsibility in what they're capable of doing. Does that make sense? Okay, so statement 7 gives us the first interpretation. So one way to interpret the faces is through God's created order. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at how God created the world. How did God create the world? And God assigned animals and beasts to do certain things. So 1, the lion may speak of untamed creatures. So again, that's one of the faces. The calf, the bull, may represent domestic creatures. The man, the greatest of all the creations. And then the eagle representing all the flying creatures. So of the living beings on the world, we can see the possibility of these 4 creatures representing all of the living creatures in the world. You have the predatorial animals, you have the servant animals, you have the flying animals, but most importantly, you have God's ultimate creation, which is humans. So, this is the angels who are seeing their relationship to the created world, and that they have some duty and responsibility on behalf of God to tend to the created world. So the lion speaks to the lion, the ox speaks to the ox, the man speaks to the man, and the bird speaks to the bird. A second way, this is number 8, A second way to interpret the faces is through the means in which God uses the cherubim. So what does that mean? Well, let's look at what the animals potentially could represent. So the lion symbolizes strength and power. The calf symbolizes service. The man symbolizes reason. And the eagle symbolizes speed. So first we looked at, the first theory was look at their created order. The second one is what can they do? What could represent their ability through their faces? So what you have here are cherubim that are represented as being able to see and be aware of vast amounts of information and action. And that these angels are powerful, dutiful, serving, rational, swift beings in discharging their duties that God would give them. It's another way of interpreting it. So they are swift, rational, servant-oriented, and powerful. Now the third way to potentially interpret the faces, and that's number 9, our third way to interpret the faces is through the lens of the 12 tribes of Israel. This is the one I think is a stretch, but it's still a possibility. So what that means is, in the rabbinical writings, which we call the Talmud, so the Talmud is the writings throughout history of the rabbis. So so Jews today, what they have they call their sacred books is they'll have the Torah, but they'll also have the Talmud. And the Talmud carries just about as much weight as you would find in the Old Testament. And so the Talmud is a lot of their references, and that's more of like an interpretation of the actual Old Testament and life application of the Old Testament is what the Talmud a lot of times can be. So in the Talmud, they wrote that there are 4 primary forms of life in God's creation: man, calf, lion, and eagle. Now, but several tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel, several tribes would identify with a certain animal. And they say that because the banners or the symbolism or the things that you would see, basically the best way to say is like if you were going to go marching in a parade, these tribes would have a certain mascot. And in these mascots is what the Old Testament would say that these tribes represented. For example, several tribes gathered around with Reuben, and Reuben's mascot was the symbol of a man. Several tribes gathered with Dan, and his mascot was an eagle. And then you had those who gathered around Ephraim, and they had their mascot was that of an ox or a calf. And then the tribes that socialized or gathered around Judah was symbolized by what? The lion of the tribe of Judah. So, yeah, there you go. See, it kind of all fits together. So not only could they represent all the created order, not only could they represent certain characteristics and attributes of the angels themselves, but it's also reasonable to say that they may have even had represented God's people because in the past God collected his people under the banner of these 4. Perhaps these angels had some special role in the life of Israel. Again, can't be overly dogmatic, but those are simple things. Have you heard any other ways to translate that or any other ways to interpret that? Some of you have been more scholarly than I am, so I like throwing it out there just to see if anybody else had any other reason. These are probably the predominant 3 interpretations of what they could be. And even to an extent, they might actually all 3 be right together. All right, so number 10. So here in Revelation, we know that they are mentioned because they play a role in the judgments of God. So when we think about Revelation, we have to ask the question, why would these living creatures be in Revelation? Because it's possible that God has created living creatures that we don't know about, that we might find out about. It's not in the Bible, but it's not to say that God didn't create them. So now we have to ask, if God does mention these creatures in the book of Revelation, we need to ask ourselves, why would they be in there? Why would God reference these? And so what we can find is how they are used in Revelation. And what we can see is that these creatures, their service to God is going to fall into two realms, which we'll talk a little bit later. But what we can initially surmise is that they're going to have a part in the judgments that God puts out on the world. And the reference to that is there's two Bible verses in Revelation. So Revelation 6:1 and Revelation 15:7. So in 6:1 it says, "It is the cherubim that calls the rider on the white horse that starts the judgments." In 15:7, it is the cherubim that hands over the bowl to pour out the final wrath of God. So we see the cherubim then being the start of the judgment and the end of a judgment. So we don't know exactly how that factors in, but we do know that they're going to play a role in the judgment that comes in the future. All right, moving on to verse 8. Verse 8 says, "Each of the four living creatures had 6 wings. They were covered with eyes around and inside." So we talked about the eyes last week, but we're going to touch on it in a little bit. But number 11, the 6 wings point to their supreme responsibility and duty to worship God. So this is reminiscent to Isaiah 6, where we see the seraphim, and each of them had 6 wings. That's how we make the connection that the cherubim are possibly also the seraphim, because there is a commonality between how they did that. So they have 6 wings. If we take Isaiah into reference and say they're the same creatures, number 12, 2 wings cover their faces because they could not what? Look on the full glory of God. So 2 to cover their face. They were created beings and couldn't look on the full glory of God without being consumed. Number 13, 2 wings covered their feet because they could not what? Stand on the holy ground of God's throne. So 2 cover their feet. The very crystal platform on which they stood is holy ground. And then number 14, 2 wings used to fly because they were not idle and ready to serve God's command. So 2 to fly with. They were ready to move, ready to do whatever God told them to do. Now what's interesting in all of that, and that's what number 15 is for, you might note that 4 of their 6 wings are related to what? Worship, and only 2 are related to service. So if you look at the 6 wings, you see 2 of those wings are going to be used to worship God. So that's the covering their eyes and also to cover their feet. And the reason why is because worship is always the top priority. Of any of the created beings of God, they worship God. Just as much as the heavens declare the glory of God, you could also find the glory in God every time you look into a microscope to see the inner workings of life itself. Everything points back to God. However, man did what? They screwed it up. That's exactly right. Man screwed it up because our worship changed. Our worship changed from the Creator to whom? Ourself, or our creation itself. We stopped worshiping the Creator but started worshiping creation itself, which means worshiping ourselves. So worship is thus their privilege, calling, and permanent occupation. This actually goes back to us talking about Satan, because many will say Satan's main role in heaven was to do what? He was a what? He was a worship leader. He led worship. So we talked about last week as the cherubims, their role was to protect God's holiness and was to preserve God's holiness. And so to do that, they led the worship. They call for those to fall down before him. They were the first to lay down before God to worship. And so it shows us that this is more in lines with us seeing that this could be Satan, because Satan wanted that worship for himself. Pride goes before the fall. And so he felt worthy of the praise and was jaded against God getting it, and he was cast out. So any major questions in regards to any of that text?
So if Satan was one of there would be 5.
Well, we don't know how many total numbers. So like same thing for angels. We know they're angels. We know there's a myriad of angels, but we don't know a number of angels. We just know in this setting that there are 4 of these cherubim working for God in Revelation. Because even when we looked at Ezekiel, it wasn't completely clear. When we look at Isaiah, it wasn't completely clear. So there's a possibility there's thousands of them. And there could be the minimum of 4 of them. So we don't know exactly how Satan fits in.
Yeah, so there's 4, but then because we say 4, we see completeness because each one of the 4 represents creation.
Mm-hmm.
So if Satan was one, the other one, what would he represent if he was if he was the 5th? Because we already have a completion. And then if we use the 4 relative to the tribes
Mm-hmm.
the 5th would fall out of that reasoning.
Right.
Too. So it'd be hard to put 5 into the current reasoning. So what would we be? Creatures of the water, or we already got everything else covered?
There's no telling.
I don't know about that. The Satan and cherubim part, I don't know.
The Ezekiel text is about as close as we can get to that. I think it's pretty sound. However, again, can't be overly dogmatic about it.
Again, is it before or after the?
Right. About the timeline.
Is Satan one of the 4? Or is Satan not one of the 4?
I would go, he's not one of the 4.
So he's thinking after the fall, yeah.
Because there's always the possibility that God created a 4th. So if he lost one, he created one. Because all 4 of the living creatures have all 4 of the ability to talk. If we say, just boil it down to, one cherubim can talk to the predators, to the servant, to the man, and to the eagle. So it's not that they just have one who does one job. As an example, the cherubim can lead all creation itself. We're in touch with them. Any other questions?
Is there any scripture that actually leads towards ranking them between archangels and cherubim?
Not necessarily. The easiest way is to always look at the proximity to God. The ones who are closest to God would by far always, I won't say always, but always lead to saying that they are more precious to God. Just as much as we look at the disciples, is that there are 12 disciples, but there was an inner group of disciples. And those, even though they were considered a part of the disciples, they were still closer to the disciples, and God held them in a higher regard, or Christ held them in a higher regard. Mm-hmm. Any?
I also think it's funny that they're covered in eyes, which I guess could be also they didn't miss anything and they see everything, but then they're covered in eyes, but then they can't look upon God. So they have all these eyes, but then they can't use them.
Right. Well, it's like their eyes. The one of the last week, the way I described that was the eyes were not to look at God, but to be aware, just to show their awareness of everything of their job, like their watchfulness. They're always aware of what's going on around them.
Again, putting it in human fault, you have all these eyes, but you can't do what you want to do with all the eyes you got.
Right. Very true. Very, very true. All right, so next week we'll starting in verse 8, we'll look at the worship of God. I'll try to put on one paper the rest of chapter 4, and then we'll spend several weeks in chapter 5.